I'm sure you've heard just about a million times that the US is in too much debt and desperately needs to get rid of it, or else the country is going to be in a ton of trouble. Currently, the US debt to GDP ratio is about 125%, which means the debt the US government owes is larger than our entire economy, and that works out to about $29.9 trillion of debt, compared to our economy of just over $23 trillion. Now, I should get one major misconception out of the way. Most U.S. debt is actually owned by the U.S., not by foreign governments. Foreign governments do own a substantial amount of U.S. debt, but their share amounts to a third of the U.S.'s outstanding debt. The other 2/3 is owned by Americans. A lot of this debt has accrued recently, by the way, borrowed by the government to fight the negative effects of the pandemic on the economy. The government borrowed to increase unemployment benefits, keep businesses that would have shut down afloat, and to provide those stimulus checks we all loved, among other things. Anyway, it's certainly true that too much debt can have negative effects on the economy. But how much debt is too much debt? Well, economists aren't sure. There's a ton of debate, but there's no settled view. Of course, that can make it hard to tell when the government should stop borrowing. But here's a more interesting thought. What if I told you that debt can be good, useful, and beneficial? In fact, economists often recommend that governments go into some debt to invest in their countries by building infrastructure that can fuel economic growth. Economies grow when spending increases, and government spending fueled by debt can facilitate increased spending. For example, the government can use debt to finance physical projects like the construction of roads, bridges, railways, or social infrastructure like schools and hospitals. Investing in infrastructure tends to help the economy grow over the long term because infrastructure facilitates trade, the movement of goods and services. People need roads to drive on, or trains or buses to hop on to get to work, to earn money, to spend on things. Companies also need roads and rail to move goods like food, electronics, and so on, to sell in stores or to ship to customers. So if roads, rail, airports, shipping ports, etc. are in better condition and connect more places, then more people, goods, and services move around to more places more quickly, which results in more sales and thus more economic growth. If the projects succeed in getting the economy to grow, the government can then tax the money out of the economy needed to pay off the debt over time. But you might be asking, why not have the government pay off the national debt completely in one go and never go into debt again? Putting aside how difficult it would be to do so in terms of raising taxes or cutting spending, the fact is that both the global economy and U.S. economy need debt in a more fundamental way. You see, buying debt, in other words purchasing bonds or treasury securities, is just about the safest investment anyone can make, because the government is unlikely to disappear. The U.S. government is a stable institution that has been around for over 2 centuries, and it has a steady, plentiful source of revenue: taxes. And not just any taxes. Taxes from the largest economy on Earth. In fact, the amount of tax money the U.S. government collects every year is greater than the size of every other nation's economy on Earth, except China's, Japan's, and Germany's. If U.S. tax revenue were its own economy, it would be the 5th largest economy on Earth. That means the U.S. is almost certainly going to be able to pay interest on whatever debt it owes. The government actually does us a favor by issuing bonds because it gives us a very safe option for investment. Most Social Security payments, which come out of your taxes, and which you probably rely on when you retire, are invested in government bonds, again because it's such a safe investment. So, if the government got rid of all its debt and decided not to issue any new bonds, what would it invest your Social Security taxes in? You might think of stocks, gold, or cryptocurrency, but all those investments are much less safe than bonds. Money literally floods in from around the world to purchase U.S. debt because foreign governments recognize that buying U.S. debt, in other words loaning money to the U.S. government, is a solid investment. In fact, nearly 60% of the reserves of foreign nations are held in U.S. dollars, and most of that is in U.S. bonds and treasury securities. The fact that U.S. bonds are so safe creates a harmonious cycle, because their safety ensures that the U.S. government gets to borrow at a very low interest rate, which makes borrowing more sensible for the U.S. than for most other governments. So, unsurprisingly, the U.S. borrows a lot. Now I'm guessing you're probably still skeptical. After all, you've probably heard your whole life that government debt is just completely bad. So let's take a look at the last time the U.S. government paid off all its debt to see how that went. It was during Andrew Jackson's administration. Jackson had been obsessed with getting rid of the national debt, and he promised to do so when running for office. So as president, he managed to do it through a combination of high tariffs, land sales, and lower spending. Then a huge economic crisis struck. Why? In large part because without government bonds to buy, investors plowed their money into riskier investments. To paraphrase Stacey Vanek Smith, an NPR reporter, without government bonds, people just didn't have a lot of safe places to put their money, so they started putting it into investment schemes, so prices for everything started rising and rising. In other words, a bubble formed. And when it popped, it destabilized the economic system and resulted in a huge downturn. So yeah, the last time we paid off our debt, it did not work out well. Of course, the US economy has changed a lot since then, so things wouldn't play out quite the same way. Exactly how it would play out is impossible to say, but how things played out last time hint that things could go pretty bad again. One way things would be different, though, is that the US economy is much more important for the global economy now, whereas back then it was relatively small and inconsequential. Now paying off all our debt, and refusing to issue any new debt, would have huge global ripple effects. Like Americans back then, global investors, foreign governments, and foreign central banks would no longer have ultra-safe US bonds to invest in, and in searching for an alternative, they might pour their money into risky investments with bad outcomes that would be terrible for the global economy. As surprising as it may sound, there was a relatively recent time when the US government thought it might end up paying off all its debt again, and policymakers were quite concerned. It was at the end of the Clinton administration, in the year 2000, when the US was running a huge surplus. That's right, instead of borrowing every year, the US government was taking in extra money. According to NPR, economists projected that the debt could be paid off by 2012. In the end, the government commissioned a secret report titled Life After Debt, in which the economist who wrote most of the report, Jason Seligman, recommended against paying off all the debt. He realized that taking away a safe haven for investment would make things difficult for Americans and foreign investors in many ways. Seligman came to the conclusion that while there is such a thing as too much debt, there is also such a thing as having too little. So does this mean that we should never worry about the debt? No, of course not. As I said at the beginning, too much national debt can be a serious problem. And in a future video, I'll explore how debt can lead to terrible outcomes, like default, inflation, hyperinflation, and so on. But for now, suffice it to say, we should try to reduce it if we can. And perhaps the best way to do so is to reduce the debt to GDP ratio by growing the size of our economy so that it surpasses the debt. The US has done this before. In World War II, the national debt also grew to be larger than the entire size of the economy. It reached 106% of GDP by 1946. But less than a decade later, the US economy had grown so much, so fast, that the debt to GDP ratio fell to a mere 54%, which is pretty good. For many reasons, it would be hard to replicate that performance now, but it shows that it's at least possible. We might not be able to do it as quickly, but we can do it over time. Well, thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, follow on social media. Take care.